Captain Robert Hayes studied the mission roster with narrowed eyes, his jaw tightening as the weight of reality pressed down on him. His SEAL team was pinned in hostile territory, surrounded by walls of crumbling stone and the deafening echo of gunfire. Enemy sharpshooters had taken position inside a centuries-old tower, nearly 800 meters away, their rifles spitting death from slits no wider than the width of a man's hand. Every attempt at rescue had failed. Every plan had been shredded by precise shots from enemies who seemed untouchable. Time was bleeding away like water from a cracked canteen. Ammunition was low, bodies were broken, and morale was stretched thin. Hayes gritted his teeth as the radio on the table burst to life with static and the clipped voice of base command. Reinforcements were being dispatched, sniper support. That was the lifeline his team needed. A single marksman capable of silencing the threat long enough to open an escape route. Hayes expected to hear the name of one of the grizzled professionals he had worked alongside in other firestorms. Men with steady nerves, hands like steel, and reputations carved from years of battle. But when the name arrived, his stomach tightened. Staff Sergeant Emma Carter will provide overwatch, the voice announced. For a heartbeat, Hayes thought he had misheard. Emma Carter? He leaned closer to the radio, disbelief carved across his features. When confirmation came, his reply cut through the static with raw frustration. You're sending us a girl. His voice carried the sharpness of a blade. This isn't a training range back home. We need a real shooter. The men around him pretended not to react, but the glance in their eyes mirrored his own disbelief. Hayes continued, unable to hold back the bitterness rising in his chest. She'll freeze the second she sees real blood. You can't thread an impossible shot through stone windows and shifting winds with someone who's never felt the weight of this kind of fire. The conditions were near impossible. 800 meters across broken city streets, through warped layers of heat shimmer, with unpredictable crosswinds snaking between alleyways. Even for the best marksman alive, it was a gamble. And this, Hayes told himself, was no time for experiments. He imagined some young woman, more concerned with appearances than ammunition, fumbling with her rifle while his men bled. The thought ignited anger, not because of who she was, but because he believed her presence proved command had lost touch with reality. What Hayes could not know was that Emma Carter was no ordinary soldier handed a rifle and a title. She was a Montana ranch girl whose life had been shaped by long hunts in snow-capped valleys, by early mornings where patience meant survival, and by the careful, deliberate lessons of a grandfather who had fought in Korea. She was steady in ways Hayes had never seen, disciplined in ways that could not be taught in a barracks classroom. At that moment, however, Hayes saw none of that. All he saw was a name he did not trust. Inside the forward operating base, miles from the chaos, Emma Carter sat beneath the faded canvas of a communications tent, her rifle spread across her lap. She was 28, her face weathered not by vanity or softness, but by years of sun, grit, and sleepless nights. She ran her hands along the cool steel of her M24 sniper weapon system for the third time that day, not out of anxiety but ritual. Each motion, checking the bolt, wiping the scope, aligning the bipod, was a silent reminder that precision was born from discipline. Outside, the Iraqi heat pressed against the tent walls, while the radio hummed with updates. Emma adjusted the brim of her old baseball cap, a gift from her father before deployment. Her reputation had spread quietly across units in the region. The woman who could split a playing card at 400 yards, the sharpshooter who never wasted a bullet. But reputation, she knew, meant little in a world where doubt clung stubbornly to her uniform. She had seen the glances in briefings, the half-jokes whispered in corners, the way senior officers' eyes instinctively turned to the men beside her when sniper support was mentioned. Each slight had been a stone in her rucksack, adding weight she had learned to carry in silence. The breaking point had come weeks earlier, in a mission planning session where Captain Hayes himself had questioned whether trusting her with Overwatch was anything more than a diversity experiment. His words had cut deep, not because they were new, but because they came from someone who led men in battle, someone whose trust was supposed to mean survival. Emma had remained silent then, her face a mask, but she remembered every nod of agreement, every dismissive smirk, every ounce of doubt. Now, with a desperate SEAL team pinned beneath enemy fire and lives hanging by a thread, the moment had arrived where talk would mean nothing. Only her scope, her breath, and the path of a bullet through impossible distance could decide whether Hayes's doubts were justified or destroyed. In the silence of her tent, Emma Carter finished cleaning her rifle, slid the bolt back with a crisp click, and closed her eyes. She thought of the snow-dusted mountains of home, of her grandfather's voice teaching her that a rifle was not a tool of power, but of responsibility. She thought of patience, of stillness, of the sacred weight that came when a life rested on the steadiness of her hands. And somewhere, across the city, Captain Hayes muttered under his breath that sending her was a mistake that might cost them everything. Long before Emma Carter found herself in the dusty heat of Iraq, her world was carved from mountains, pine forests, and endless skies. She grew up in Glacier County, Montana, where winters bit deep into the skin and summers stretched wide with golden grass, swaying under a relentless sun. Life on her family's ranch was not gentle. It demanded endurance, grit, and a patience that city life never taught. Her earliest memory of a rifle came at age 7. She stood beside her grandfather, Samuel Carter, on the porch of their weathered farmhouse. His hands, scarred and stiff from the war in Korea, guided hers as she tried to hold the heavy Springfield rifle steady. The smell of oil and old wood filled her nose. He did not talk about the thrill of shooting, nor did he romanticize the act. Instead, he spoke about responsibility. Every shot, he told her in his gravelly voice, carries weight. You don't fire to prove you can. You fire because life depends on it. Emma learned quickly that the rifle was not a toy, not a symbol of power, but a tool bound by discipline. At first, she struggled even to keep her arms from trembling, but Samuel never scolded. He made her slow her breathing, close one eye, and focus not on the target but on stillness itself. That day, when her bullet struck the edge of the old tin can balanced on a fence post, she did not feel triumph. She felt awe at what patience could achieve. Her father, Michael Carter, was a hunting guide who spent months leading clients into the rugged wilderness. Where Samuel had taught her philosophy, Michael taught her survival. He showed her how to track elk through snow, how to move silently across brittle underbrush, and how to read the wind by watching the sway of branches high above. She carried a rifle slung across her small shoulders on countless hunts, sometimes waiting hours in bitter cold for a single moment of movement in the distance. By 12, Emma could split a pine cone at 400 yards with her grandfather's rifle. At 16, she was entering competitive shooting matches across the western states, her calm focus unnerving opponents twice her age. While other teenagers chased parties or worried about dances, Emma found herself in dusty arenas, lined up beside men who sneered until her shots outpaced theirs. She learned to ignore the mutters of disbelief, the sideways glances, when judges announced her scores. Each bullseye was not just a mark on paper. It was proof that patience, control, and resolve could silence any doubt. Her family supported her, though they knew the world would not always be kind. Samuel often reminded her that talent alone was not enough. She would need the resilience to carry doubt on her back without letting it crush her. He had lived through a war where every decision could mean death, and he recognized in his granddaughter a spark of that same steel. Those lessons became Emma's compass. She rose before dawn, trekking into the hills with her rifle. She learned to stay motionless as frost coated her eyelashes, to breathe evenly while her heartbeat pounded in her ears, and to hold steady when elk appeared as silent shadows in the mist. The land itself shaped her character, mountains teaching her patience, storms teaching her resilience, and open plains teaching her humility. At 19, when Emma enlisted, she already carried with her a foundation that most recruits could never match. Boot camp at Fort Benning sharpened her, but it was less transformation and more refinement. Instructors marveled at her ability to remain still for hours during sniper exercises, her uncanny talent for reading wind and distance. She passed every marksmanship trial with ease, though whispers often followed her success. Some believed her scores had to be mistakes. Others assumed she was being granted leniency. Emma ignored it all. She remembered her grandfather's advice: never waste energy proving yourself to those who will not see. Instead, Let actions speak louder than words. Her first deployments tested her more than any competition could. In rugged terrain overseas, she carried the same lessons from Montana. She learned to watch rooftops for enemy movement, to calculate angles while her heart hammered, and to maintain calm when chaos erupted. Each mission added a quiet tally to her growing reputation. Her overwatch saved patrols from ambushes, her spotting uncovered hidden explosives, and her precision removed threats before they could claim lives. But still, respect came slowly. Emma often felt invisible during briefings, her presence dismissed as an afterthought. Younger men with less experience were trusted more readily, their words given weight, while hers drifted unheard. Each slight pressed against her like the Montana wind, sharp and cold. Yet she endured, because she had endured harsher. The rifle became her voice, speaking in ways words could not. Every mission she completed was another stone in the wall of evidence she built silently around herself. Each confirmed shot was a statement. She belonged here, no matter what anyone thought. When nights grew heavy, and doubt whispered in her own mind, Emma turned to the lessons carved deep by Samuel and Michael. Responsibility, patience, respect for the burden of taking life. She thought of the Montana skies, wide and endless, and reminded herself that storms always passed. Now, years later, as Captain Hayes dismissed her without ever seeing her hands on the trigger, Emma carried all of Montana within her. She carried the patience of snowbound hunts, the precision of years of practice, and the quiet weight of her grandfather's words. She knew that men like Hayes had doubted her all her life, and she knew how to answer. Not with arguments, not with anger, but with the silence of a breath, the stillness of a scope, and the truth revealed in a single, perfectly placed shot. By the time Emma Carter completed her first tour, she had already learned the harsh rhythm of military life. Victories whispered, failures shouted, and respect always dangled just out of reach. While her record spoke of precision and dependability, the eyes of many still lingered on her with doubt. To them, she was not a sniper. She was an experiment. Her days often began long before sunrise. She would sit cross-legged on the dusty floor of her quarters, field stripping her rifle with the ritualistic patience. Each piece laid carefully in order, each motion performed with mechanical precision. Soldiers passing by might think she was obsessive, but for Emma, this routine was survival. The weapon was an extension of her will. If it failed, lives ended. That knowledge was never far from her thoughts. On missions, Emma's role was simple in theory but brutal in practice: overwatch. She positioned herself in hidden places, waiting with the patience of a mountain cat, eyes locked through her scope for hours at a time. The heat burned, the insects bit, and the body stiffened until even small movements felt like punishment. Still she endured. The enemy was clever, often disguising movement in the shadows, blending into the terrain. But Emma's training, and her years hunting in Montana, gave her an edge. She noticed details others missed: the subtle shift of fabric against stone, the faint glint of glass betraying a scope, the unnatural stillness of someone waiting to kill. Her first true test came during a convoy mission in the outskirts of Ramadi. A column of vehicles moved through narrow streets when Emma, watching from a crumbling rooftop, noticed a man kneeling in the distance. To most eyes, he looked like any other civilian adjusting a bundle on the ground. But Emma's instincts screamed otherwise. She whispered a warning into her headset: IED placement, 20 meters ahead. The lead vehicle halted. Soldiers dismounted, and sure enough, they found explosives hidden beneath loose pavement stones. Her call had saved dozens of lives. When the convoy returned, soldiers clapped her on the shoulder, offering quick words of thanks. Yet, in the next briefing, her name was glossed over. The credit shifted toward the unit as a whole, her contribution swallowed in the tide of collective success. Emma said nothing. She had learned to keep her pride silent. Another mission brought sharper stakes. Intelligence had pinpointed an enemy sniper terrorizing coalition patrols. 3 men had already fallen, each with a single bullet to the chest. Emma was assigned to hunt the hunter. She spent 2 days concealed among rubble, enduring blistering heat and biting cold. Finally, she caught a flicker of movement in a ruined minaret. Her pulse slowed as she aligned her shot. One breath, Another. The rifle cracked, and the enemy's reign ended in silence. Back at base, word spread quickly, but recognition was scarce. Officers acknowledged the successful elimination of a threat, yet rarely mentioned her name aloud. Whispers filled the gaps instead. Some claimed it had been luck. Others insisted another soldier must have fired the shot. Emma listened without reaction, though inside she carried both pride and exhaustion. The burden of proof seemed endless. The constant doubt was not limited to strangers. Even among those she worked with daily, small slights eroded the edges of trust. During planning sessions, maps would be passed over her as if her eyes were invisible. Questions about sniper positions would be directed to younger men with less experience. Jokes about babysitting her were made behind her back, but loud enough for her to hear. Yet Emma never raised her voice. She remembered her grandfather's wisdom. Confidence does not demand applause. Instead, she focused on her tally, a small piece of tape on her rifle stock, where she marked each confirmed save or elimination, not as trophies, but as reminders. Every line was proof that someone had lived because she had remained steady. 12 marks now decorated the tape, each carved into her memory like scars. At night, when she lay awake listening to the distant rumble of artillery, she thought of Montana. She remembered the stillness of dawn hunts, the smell of pine, the soft crunch of frost beneath boots. Those memories reminded her who she was, anchoring her in a place where doubt could not touch her. But even the strongest anchors shift under storm. The breaking point came during a joint operation briefing with Captain Hayes's team. Maps were spread across the table, red markers circling enemy compounds. Hayes scanned the assignments, and when his eyes landed on Emma's name listed under sniper support, his expression hardened. "Are we really trusting our lives to her?" he asked, voice dripping with skepticism. "This isn't target practice. My men need a professional, not a gamble." The room went still. Emma sat 3 feet away, every word striking like a blade. Major Alvarez, the base commander, quickly interjected, pointing out her record, her unmatched accuracy scores, her successful missions. But Hayes pressed harder. He spoke of physical demands, of the chaos of combat, of the need for someone who had proven themselves. Several of his men nodded, their agreement like stones added to her burden. Emma said nothing. She had learned silence was stronger than anger. But as she left that briefing, she carried their doubt like an invisible wound. Alone that night, she dismantled her rifle again and again, her hands moving with restless precision. The cold metal was the only thing that felt certain in a world where she herself was treated as uncertain. Her grandfather's words returned to her then. The hardest part of being a sniper isn't the shot. It's carrying the doubts of others while never doubting yourself. Emma whispered those words like a prayer, her fingers tracing the tally marks on her rifle stock. She knew she had proven herself countless times already, but clearly it was not enough. She would have to prove it again, and again, and again, until the bullet of truth shattered every doubt that stood in her way. The call came in just after dawn. Static bled through the radio, followed by the clipped urgency of Captain Hayes's voice. His team was trapped in the city of Romani, cut off during what was supposed to be a swift raid. The target had been more heavily fortified than intelligence predicted. Now, Hayes and his men were barricaded inside a half-collapsed building while enemy fighters closed in like wolves circling prey. Multiple wounded. Ammunition running dry. "We can't move without taking fire," Hayes reported, his voice low but edged with desperation. The problem was clear. Enemy snipers had the high ground. They were nested in a centuries-old minaret, its stone walls weathered but still standing tall above the rooftops. From its narrow windows, enemy sharpshooters had clean sight lines across every possible escape route. Any movement, any attempt at extraction, would be met with precise, lethal fire. Conventional air support was out of the question. The city below was alive with civilians, and one miscalculated strike would turn the mission into tragedy. Ground reinforcements tried to reposition, but each attempt ended the same. Gunfire forcing them back, bullets ricocheting through the dust. By mid-morning, Hayes's voice carried a new weight, fear wrapped in control. "We won't hold much longer," he admitted. One man was critically wounded. Blood loss was stealing minutes they didn't have. At the forward operating base, commanders scrambled through options. Maps were unfolded, routes traced and dismissed, strategies whispered then abandoned. Every plan fell apart under the shadow of that stone tower. At last, all eyes turned to Emma Carter. She had been silent until then, studying the tactical maps, noting wind direction reports, elevation charts, the shifting patterns of heat across the city streets. She knew the problem wasn't the distance alone. She had trained at ranges beyond 800 meters. The real challenge was threading a bullet through the minaret's narrow windows while fighting crosswinds, urban shimmer, and the suffocating knowledge that lives depended on her. Major Alvarez looked at her, his face tight. "Sergeant Carter, can you make the shot?" The room was still. Emma did not answer immediately. She closed her eyes, recalling mornings in Montana, the way mist curled around the tree-line, the patience of waiting for hours with a rifle balanced against her cheek. She thought of her grandfather's words, "Trust your stillness." Finally, she nodded. "I'll need a clear rooftop," she said. Minutes later, Emma was moving through the streets with a small escort. Dust hung in the air, stirred by the distant thud of mortars. They guided her to a building with a line of sight to the minaret, though at a brutal angle. She climbed the cracked stairwell, each step echoing faintly as though the building itself held its breath. On the rooftop, she lay flat against the sun-baked concrete and assembled her rifle. Every movement was precise, bipod unfolded, scope aligned, bolt checked. She pulled the brim of her old baseball cap low, shielding her eyes from glare. Then she settled into position, her cheek resting against the stock, her breathing slowing until the chaos below blurred into silence. Through her scope, the minaret loomed. The stone was pitted with age, windows cut like slits of shadow. Inside, she saw the flicker of muzzle flashes, enemy snipers firing down at Hayes's pinned team. She steadied her crosshairs, adjusted for wind drift, compensated for the shimmer rising from rooftops. Her first shot cracked through the air. The bullet struck stone, sending chips flying inches from its target. Inside the tower, the enemy sniper flinched, ducking back. Hayes's men shouted over the radio. The sudden silence from the tower gave them a sliver of relief. Emma exhaled slowly, made a minute adjustment, and fired again. This time, the result was immediate. The muzzle flashes ceased. Through her scope, she caught a glimpse of a figure crumpling backward into the shadows. But there were more. She shifted, finding the next window. Another enemy raised his rifle, his scope glinting for a fraction of a second. Emma squeezed the trigger. The bullet lanced through the opening, and the figure dropped. Shot after shot, she dismantled the nest. Each bullet was a whisper of finality. Each pull of the trigger a declaration that patience and discipline could turn the impossible into reality. Observers later swore the shots were inhuman, threading gaps no wider than a handspan, defying wind and heat. But for Emma, it was nothing more than the stillness she had carried since childhood. At last, the tower was silent. No more flashes, no more bullets raining down. The extraction team seized the moment. Helicopters swept in low, their blades slicing through the heavy air as Hayes and his wounded men were lifted to safety. 3 hours later, when the helicopter touched down at the base, Hayes emerged bloodied but alive. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with exhaustion. He walked across the dust toward Emma, who sat cross-legged, already cleaning her rifle with calm detachment. For a long moment, Hayes said nothing. He looked at the woman he had doubted, the woman whose hands had delivered his team from certain death. At last, his voice broke the silence, low and rough. "I was wrong," he admitted. "Completely wrong. You saved us all." Emma didn't look up. She simply continued wiping the bolt, her movements steady as always. She didn't need his words. Her rifle had spoken for her. But in that moment, something shifted. For the first time, Hayes looked at her not as a burden or an experiment, but as a soldier who had done what no one else could. The days following the Romani rescue blurred into a rhythm of reports, debriefs, and quiet astonishment. Word spread quickly across the forward operating base, carried in fragments of radio chatter and whispered conversations in the mess hall. Soldiers spoke of the Montana sniper who had turned the tide with a series of shots no one believed possible. Her name moved from uncertain speculation to firm requests. Teams began insisting on her presence for upcoming missions. They didn't want just any sniper. They wanted Emma Carter. For Emma, the shift was subtle but undeniable. Officers who once overlooked her in briefings now turned their eyes toward her with questions. Maps were slid across the table in her direction, her opinion sought, her judgment valued. New arrivals to the base were told of her skill before they even met her, the skepticism that once shadowed her reputation now fading under the weight of her actions. Yet Emma carried herself the same as always. She didn't boast, didn't seek applause. Instead, she followed the rituals that grounded her: meticulous cleaning of her rifle, quiet preparation before missions, and the silent tally of marks on the tape wrapped around her stock. Each tally still meant the same thing it always had: not victory, not pride, but responsibility. Each was a reminder of the lives she had protected, the heavy price of precision. Captain Hayes, meanwhile, wrestled with his own transformation. He had entered that mission certain she would fail, convinced that her inclusion was reckless. But when he replayed the events in his mind, the silence that followed each impossible shot, the way his men were able to move because of her, he felt something deeper than gratitude. He felt humility. For the first time in his long career, he realized his assumptions had blinded him. He sought her out one evening, finding her on the rooftop of the base, where she often sat alone. The desert wind tugged at her hair, and her rifle rested across her knees. She looked at him when he approached, but said nothing, waiting. "I don't expect forgiveness," Hayes admitted, his voice heavy. "But I need you to know, you saved my men. You saved me. I judged you before I ever gave you a chance. That was my failure, not yours." Emma studied him for a long moment. Then she gave a slight nod. She didn't need to remind him of his words in the briefing room, didn't need to dig into the bitterness of old wounds. The battlefield had already delivered the verdict. After that, Hayes treated her differently. In meetings, he deferred to her expertise. On missions, he trusted her judgment without question. And in private, he carried the memory of his doubt as a lesson he would never forget. Months passed, marked by missions that tested every ounce of resolve. Emma continued to provide overwatch, her rifle speaking louder than any argument could. She spotted ambushes before they unfolded, eliminated threats before they could strike, and gave soldiers the courage to move through dangerous terrain, knowing her eyes were watching from above. Each time she returned, she added another tally to the tape on her rifle. By the end of her deployment, the strip of leather was nearly covered. To others, those marks might have looked like victories. To Emma, they were reminders of the weight she carried, proof that responsibility was never lifted. It only grew heavier. When the time came for her rotation home, the base gathered in quiet respect. Commendations were handed down, citations read aloud. Her name appeared in official reports with words like extraordinary precision and indispensable support. Commanders praised her professionalism, Hayes himself delivering a brief speech about the night in Romani that none of them would forget. But Emma felt little interest in medals or ceremonies. What mattered most was that she had done her duty, that lives had been saved because she had trusted her stillness. She thought of her grandfather often during those final weeks, the man who had placed a heavy rifle in her small hands, who had taught her patience, who had reminded her that the true challenge of a sniper was not the shot itself, but the weight of what followed. As the plane carried her back across oceans, Emma stared out the window at the endless sky. She thought of Montana, the wide valleys, the quiet forests, the snow that lay heavy on pine branches. She longed for the simplicity of dawn hunts, of walking trails, where only the wind and the call of elk filled the air. Yet she also knew she was no longer the girl who had once waited silently in the frost. War had carved her into something different, stronger, perhaps, but also heavier. She carried memories that would never leave, the faces of those she had saved, the silence of those she had not. Back home, people would ask her about Iraq. Some would expect stories of heroics, of bullets and triumph. She would give them little, because Emma understood that the truth of war was not in glory, but in the quiet burden carried afterward. Still, there was a quiet satisfaction within her, not because she had proven Hayes wrong, nor because her name had spread through special operations channels, but because she had lived up to the lessons her grandfather had instilled. Patience, precision, responsibility. Those values had guided her through the storm, and they would guide her still. On her last night at the base, Emma sat alone, rifle across her lap, running her hands along the worn tape. She counted each tally, whispering a name or a moment to herself. She knew these marks would fade one day. The tape replaced, the rifle passed on, but the weight of them would remain inside her forever. As the desert wind whispered across the rooftop, Emma Carter closed her eyes. She was no longer the doubted recruit, no longer the overlooked sniper. She was the woman who had steadied her breath, trusted her silence, and carried responsibility with unshakable resolve. The girl from Montana had found her place in the war, one perfectly placed shot at a time.